This is the home of the Robert Goodman family on West 86th Street, New York City. The upper middle-class comfort of this block is a great distance in both time and space from the state of Mississippi. Yet this summer, one of Robert Goodman's sons, Andrew, a 20-year-old Queens College student, went south with 400 members of the Mississippi Summer Project to help register Negro voters. Traveling with him were two other young men, James Chaney, a Negro raised in Mississippi, and Michael Schwerner, a New York social worker. On June 20th, the trio arrived in Meridian, Mississippi. Within 24 hours, they had disappeared. The search for the missing civil rights workers held the nation's attention for 6 long weeks, until August 4th, when their bodies were discovered under an earthen dam. What were the motivations, the values, that took Andy Goodman so far from home to help people he had never met? He had never known the degradation that James Chaney had experienced, nor had he dedicated his life to social work as Michael Schwerner had done. The people who knew Andy best, his family, his friends, his teachers, can help provide the clues. They are the people who helped Andy grow and who grew with him. They set the examples and shared the dreams. In what they say, in their faces and their memories, perhaps we will be able to understand Andy Goodman and why he died. I'm Frank McGee. This is New York Illustrated.
Goodman, Andy's mother. We've lived in this same neighborhood ever since Andy was born. We lived in this very apartment for the last 15 years, and before that we lived around the corner.
My name is Robert Goodman. I'm Andy Goodman's father. It's hard to talk about Andy this time, and yet, sitting as we are here, it's very easy to think of him. He grew up in this house and lived with its values, fun, pleasure, seriousness, and purpose.
I thought about the kind of special meaning that Andy has had to me. It may have been because Andy was the middle of 3 children, and he became a kind of arbiter between his brothers in many ways. It may have been because Andy had a specially highly developed ability for feeling what other people are feeling, that this was a very keen sense in Andy. Some of us can know and understand, but don't have the ability to quite feel as deeply about certain questions. Andy could. He felt it was important that people get fair treatment. I think that because of the person that Andy was, he selected certain kinds of friends and was likely to be attracted to people who felt and had the same kinds of beliefs as he did. Joni Cadden is soft and sweet and gentle and also concerned about our world and the life that they were growing into.
I knew him in school. I knew him actually from the time we were both 2 to the time we graduated from high school, since we both went to the same school for, I guess it was 15 years. We used to, have dates after school. I think that's what you call it when you're 6 or 7, and play in the park and stuff. days we'd just sit around and sort of pull grass out of the ground or build things with pebbles in the park or with pieces of his mother's furniture in the house. And sometimes we'd race around the house and throw things and stuff like that. In high school, I think he was cynical about people with affectations and false sophistications. In a lot of ways, he was a very sophisticated person himself, but in a lot of deep ways. He wasn't really sophisticated in the sense of being socially polished, that sort of thing. He wasn't cynical about the world in general, really. He was enthusiastic about everything from the modern jazz quartet and Boris Godunov to athletics and poetry, and he was not a bad writer.
Ralph Engelman was Andy's closest friend, and the depth of their friendship was this great concern about people and about the world in which they were about to inherit.
My first impression was that he was a quiet person. Andy didn't stand out at first. It wasn't important to him to stand out. I think he was a person of unusual depth. He was, on one hand, very introspective, and then on the other hand, he was somehow very free. And I think that in getting to know Andy, and by the nation getting to know Andy, they learned quite a bit about the civil rights movement, too, because this stereotype, I think, was in some ways shattered by this somewhat enigmatic figure which the nation got to know. And it was a very interesting trio. I mean, James Chaney was a Negro from Mississippi. Michael Schwerner was a social worker who graduated Columbia School of Social Work and had obviously dedicating his life to this. But Andy, I think, represented another important element in the civil rights movement, and also among young people today, and that is a person who really took advantage in the best sense of what his society had to offer, and was slated to make a great contribution to our society. I think he did, but he could have made a very, more of one, of course, if he had lived.
My name is Ruth Grinsweig. I went to high school with Andy, and I was his girlfriend. One of the most distinctive things about Andy was his involvement in whatever he was interested in at any particular time. He did everything totally. When he was interested in theater, he really went out and auditioned and got parts and worked hard at them. When he was interested, as he always was interested in music, he, for instance, would sit up till 5 in the morning listening to jazz. We often got into discussions on various things, politics or just life in general, and I always had the sense that he was trying to find answers to questions he was feeling and thinking very hard about things, but not in a compulsive way, but because it was important to him.
Andy started nursery school when he was about 3 years old at Walden School. He continued in that same school, in that same building, where his other two brothers spent the same amount of time, that is, from nursery school through his graduation at high school. And he really developed roots in many ways. Got to know teachers who became terribly important in his life. Dick Crosscup has been English teacher for many years at Walden School. Dick is a man who really and truly believes and lives the kinds of values that Andy adopted and which became his own.
I taught Andy for 7 years in a row, starting with 6th grade. He was a boy who had a very deep, intuitive insight into people, their feelings, and a very great integrity. But having an integrity like Huckleberry Finn, he could only do what he saw was right. So that this was rather upsetting to him sometimes when he was a youngster. Of course, as he developed and matured and came to prize his own integrity, he became quite strong for these reasons. Strong in the way one is strong who does have that integrity and who knows to live by his own integrity. And in some ways, he's not the kind of boy one would think of as being shaped up to be a hero. He's the kind of boy one would think was going to be an artist, possibly an actor, a writer, working in some creative field. This is the kind of thing that usually his kinds of sensitivities lead one to do, and it's probably what he would have been. But apparently whatever the civil rights struggle was, said other things to him, said you've got to go into action. But these are things in a person's own soul that we can't fathom.
Augustus Pigman, who was a teacher at Walden School, is quite a wonderful human being. And both Andy and he were devoted to each other.
Andy was not somebody that was withdrawing from life. He was really in life. And he was, I know that some people that go on expeditions, such as the one to Mississippi, are pulling away from life, but that was not the case with Andy. Andy was in on things. He was a boy that entered things with whatever was going on with a good deal of spirit.
At one time, it entered our mind that perhaps we ought to move to another part of the city or to the suburbs. And then as we talked about and thought about it further, we realized that this was absolutely ridiculous for us, because as far as the large numbers of people who moved into the side streets and lived in overcrowded areas, this was something which was part of living in the city and part of the thing that our children were going to have to face at one time or another. Moving away or running away from it was just not in keeping with the way we did things. And our kids, as a result, became very much aware of the problems of the people who were living in the more crowded and slum areas of this vicinity. Of the many influences in Andy's life, one of the very, very important ones were the summers that he spent in the northern part of our state, in the Adirondacks. In Tupper Lake, we have a family home, and it was there that Andy spent every summer of his life, and this was unquestionably his second home, but a very special kind of a home. It was there in Tupper Lake that Andy learned to love the country, the outdoors, the freedom, the purity of living in that kind of surrounding.
I'm David Goodman, Andrew Goodman's brother. Tupper has been a great influence on all of us in this whole family, on Andy, on myself, on my brother Jonathan, my father and my mother. And I think that Tupper had given Andy a great deal of time to think about what he was going to do and what he was planning to do with his life, and I believe that Tupper had a great deal to do with his decisions.
Andy's cousin. They resemble each other in some ways. They have the same kind of wonderful impulsiveness of doing things, and both the same kind of joie de vivre, and they enjoyed each other immensely.
And I think he went mainly because it was a way to get away from New York and a way to get away from all the people who he knew here and be alone for a while and think about what he wanted to do. There's a concrete bridge down the road from the house, about 2 minutes walk, that my grandfather built, I guess, 4 years ago. And when the cement was drying, when they poured the cement, well, Andy and I and the rest of my cousins, we all wrote our names all over it and the date. Andy was very much like my grandfather, and my grandfather had a favorite term that he used. He said there were some people who were talkers and some people who were doers. And he was always, my grandfather was always a doer. He was never talked much about what he wanted to do. He just went ahead and did it. And I think this is very much the way Andy was. And if he believed in something, or if he wanted to do something, he would go out and he would try it. And then he would do it without talking about it much or making a big production about it.
Well, Andy was basically more of a doer than myself. My work involves doing things. My attitudes are that way. But I would say the prime example and the prime force was my father, Andrew's grandfather. I'm a civil engineer. Andy's interest in this work was one which was temporary. He wanted to work to find out perhaps what it was that he was looking for, because he didn't know. We have not been demanding on our children to the extent that we want you to do this because it's good for you, except to say, in a sense, without saying it, more by example than by direction. This is a wide world, and it's quite a beautiful one. Pick a way and make your own purpose.
Andy and his father had many basic interests in common. While they differed in how they did things and how they approached things, they were alike in many, many ways.
One winter's night, or early spring, he came to us and said he thought he would go to Mississippi on the summer project. When he spoke about it, he told us that permission was required, and we were concerned for his safety, and yet we gave our permission, and we were very proud to, because, as I said before, Andy only could express himself and believed that he was expressing himself in the doing, and it was to us very natural that if he thought something, he would want to do it.
And the night before he left for Oxford, our whole family was together, and we went to see Blues for Mr. Charlie. And I must say that I was very intense that night. And of course, my concern was sharpened by the content of that play, which talks about the way in which the Negro people are treated in the South, the way in which they can be murdered, and the murderers go scot-free. I couldn't help thinking all the time about Andy and his going into that situation, and the play had a very special significance. And I kept looking at Andy as he was watching the play very intently. Kept looking at him, his beauty, his intensity, his concern. And I was sad and worried. Michael Hampshire is a young artist whom Andy met comparatively recently. He decided he would like to do a painting of Andy. Michael saw Andy as a young man, literally in the morning of his life, and he calls the painting Andy A.M., which sadly has a double meaning because anti-meridian means something else now as well. Michael caught Andy in all his seriousness, in all his intensity, in all his determination. And he placed him in the lower part of the canvas because, as Michael said, the idea was that Andy was to grow into the fullness of the day. This was his true beginning. Not dawn, mind you, but morning. When I first saw it, I just reached out my hand without thinking to touch it. It seemed so alive. When Andy was accepted by the Mississippi Project, I felt a pang of fear and concern. I knew he was going to be accepted. He himself wasn't sure, because in the screening process there were many people who were rejected, and anybody who in any way gave any hint of adventurism or doing this as a kind of running away in any sense were rejected. I felt when he asked us to sign his permission to go down there, a mixture of fear, pleasure, concern, but above it all, we knew, my husband and I, that to deny him the right to go down there would be to deny everything in life that we had stood for, my husband, myself, our family, would be to deny that any of the things we did or said had any meaning, and it would have been to say that our life has been a lie. And we couldn't do that. We couldn't ever have faced ourselves or Andy if we had done that. And if you believe it as we believe it, that it has to be.
Andy Goodman grew up in a comfortable home filled with art, music, literature, in a family that has purpose, dignity, and morality. These were the gifts given Andy by his parents, strengthened by the friends and teachers he was fortunate to have. And Andy was strong because of this. But he was not a heroic figure. He had his faults, his frailties, he had his failures. But the impression we are left with is that Andy was typical of a large and too often ignored segment of American youth. His involvement with the civil rights cause was only one of his many activities, only one of his many interests, or one of his many concerns about the world he was growing into. He loved life and he knew how to enjoy it. And perhaps it was for this very reason that he wished all people to know and enjoy life as he had, and was willing to risk his own life so that they might more fully attain theirs. When all hope had faded and Andy's fate was known, his mother told the world, Andy was a beautiful young man, and the world needs more beautiful young people. Andy Goodman and his parents have set the example for the have more beautiful young people. I'm Frank McGee.